Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday at AAMDC, the Health Minister talked about some important issues, and I believe Albertans will be interested in what the Minister is thinking. I thank the Minister for saying that the Rural Physician Action Plan is staying. She did, however, say that funding will only be extended until fall, and because they're not getting maximum bang for the buck. That sounds like change. To the Minister, how are we not getting best bang for the buck with RPAP, and what changes to the program are you planning in the fall?
Deputy.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, for the question and for the opportunity to make sure I clearly communicate to the member opposite what seems to be a little misconstrued. So certainly, at the end of every grant cycle, I think the responsible thing for any government to do, I think for our government, I'm sure for other governments at municipal level and so on, is to make sure you looked at the desired outcomes achieved for that grant and the actual outcomes. And while that grant in its current structure is set to expire this spring, we've extended the current level of funding through to the fall so that we make sure that we have an opportunity to consider carefully how we're going to continue to move forward. Our PAP will continue to be there. We need to figure out how to best use the resources, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Health Minister was asked yesterday about funding for a helicopter ambulance service called Halo in Medicine Hat and another service in Fort McMurray. AHS pays for 25% of STAR's mission costs, and the PC party supports that. The minister told Municipal Leader that she had no good news today, and an evidence-based decision would be made after AHS and a fair process takes place. To the minister, I know you believe rural lives are as valuable as urban lives. Will you ask AHS to support air ambulance services in Medicine Hat and Fort McMurray?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Communities around this province have different ways of making sure that we can safely evacuate individuals in a time of crisis. Some municipalities do use STARS, some use HALO, some use fixed wing, and some use ground transportation. And the appropriate thing, I think, to do is to make sure that we have a budget that's reasonable and sustainable. I'm really proud that we are working to get through interim supply and supplementary supply in this House, and to make sure that money is given to AHS and that they most correctly work with the communities to make sure that they have a safe evacuation plan, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday at AAMDC, our Environment Minister actually complimented Peter Lougheed. She said that his government's support for accelerated oil sands development was a good example of government leadership. Many of us are familiar with the Environment Minister's vilification of the energy industry in general and the oil sands in particular. My question for the Environment Minister is simple. After all the conflicting messages, please now make it clear for all of Alberta, do you now support Alberta's oil sand industry? Yes or no?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I made very clear in my response from the speech from the throne, I grew up in an oil patch community. My dad was an electrician who worked on oil rigs, and he was one of the people who lost his job in 1982 when the National Energy Program came into place. So I don't actually think I need to explain my history. But what I will do, Mr. Speaker, is draw attention to all of those folks who stood on a stage with me on November 22nd, Mr. Speaker, and said the following things like, I believe this plan will lead to Albertans and Canadians receiving full value for their oil and gas resources. Brian Ferguson, Synovus. Brian Ferguson, again, I'm not sure I would use the word radical to describe being a leader. I would describe it as being bold.